Welcome back. The Supreme Court has agreed to review the legality of President Trump's executive order to end birthright citizenship in the U.S. It is a landmark case that could upend millions of lives of Americans and lawful U.S. residents. For more, let's bring in former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Tom Dupree. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Happy we could make it happen. So we've got a lot to get to. I want to start with this birthright citizenship ban being taken up by the Supreme Court. You know, can you explain for folks, why did the lower court strike down the day one executive order? How likely is it that the Supreme Court will uphold it? And then what ramifications could it have?
Okay, so the reason the lower court struck it down is because the 14th Amendment, which is what ostensibly gives rise to birthright citizenship, has been on the books for more than a century, really ever since the end of the Civil War, and it's been interpreted by courts, including the Supreme Court, to suggest that birthright citizenship is the law of the land. So I think from the perspective of a lot of the lower courts that have handled these initial cases challenging birthright citizenship, they basically said, hey, this is settled law, this ship sailed a long time ago, we're not going to revisit it. Now, of course, the Supreme Court gets to decide what the Constitution means on its own, and it will be doing so. This case has the potential to be an absolute blockbuster. My best guess or prediction is that the Supreme Court may continue to maintain that birthright citizenship is required as a matter of constitutional law, but I do think it's going to be a much closer case than a lot of people think. I think the administration has put forward fairly reasonable, somewhat, surprisingly compelling arguments for why they're right, arguments that maybe a lot of people haven't really thought about before. But at the end of the day, I do think it may be a bit of an uphill battle for the administration to persuade a majority of the court that birthright citizenship is not constitutional.
Okay. On to the pardons. The president's been on a bit of a pardon blitz. You had the ex-Honduran president who was a convicted drug trafficker. He was pardoned. That was a little controversial. And then another controversial pardon this past week. Texas Democratic Representative Henry Cuellar and his wife, who were indicted last year on bribery and money laundering charges. They were alleged to have taken some $600,000 in bribes from Azerbaijan. And shortly after the president pardoned Cuellar, Cuellar announced plans to run again as a Democrat, to which the president did not take kindly. He said on Truth Social, such a lack of loyalty, something that Texas voters and Henry's daughters will not like. Oh, well, next time, no more Mr. Nice Guy. And then Cuellar responded to that this morning. Listen to what he said.
I'm a Democrat. I'm probably one of the most, if not the most, bipartisan Democrat. And as I told some of my Republican friends on the House floor, I vote better than some of the Republicans in the Republican caucus, and they agree with me.
So he's seeming to indicate that maybe he will side with the president on some legislative issues. But more broadly, do you see any pattern in how the president is coming to these decisions on who to pardon and what cases to take on?
I do. And look, the president is wielding his pardon power very aggressively, and he is not afraid of controversial pardons, as we've seen. I think in the Cuellar case, what really was driving Trump's decision to issue the pardon was a sense that Cuellar himself was a victim of a weaponized prosecution by the Biden administration. This is something, obviously, President Trump feels about very strongly, very personally. In his view, he, too, was a victim of a politicized Justice Department. And I think when he looked at Cuellar's situation, he saw maybe some similarities, that Cuellar, in Trump's view, was being unfairly penalized and prosecuted for standing up for a strong border back in the Biden administration days. And so for that reason, Trump concluded that Cuellar had been unfairly prosecuted. He granted him the pardon, but now it looks like there may not have been quite a shared understanding of what the pardon would mean. In Trump's view, maybe it meant Cuellar should officially join the Republican Party. That's certainly not how Cuellar sees it.
No, and I take your point that the Biden DOJ over prosecution is sort of a theme through these pardons, but it hasn't all been, Biden cases. There was one individual who was just indicted, I believe, by the president's own Justice Department, right?
It was, yeah. The Honduran president who was pardoned, that was something that was pursued under the Trump administration. So I don't think you can attribute that one to Biden over prosecution. But it does fit in the larger theme of Trump seeing people who, for whatever reason, in his view, are being unfairly prosecuted. Oftentimes, these are political officials. That may play into the calculus as well.
Okay. And on the pardons themselves, the President Trump has tried, at least, to reverse some of the pardons that his predecessor made, alleging that because they were done with autopen, they are void, vacant, and of no further force or effect. There's a point to, examining these autopen pardons, since there were a lot of them, and I covered the Biden administration. I remember there were a couple cases that, caught them on their heels. There was the Cash for Kids judge guy in Pennsylvania who it really sort of a controversy that Biden pardoned him. They made the argument that they all fit this sort of standard that made their way through, that they met sort of requirements to get the pardon. But President Trump is basically saying, look, nothing that Biden did with autopen on pardons is valid anymore. Can he do that?
Well, I don't think he's going to be on super strong legal ground and challenging the use of the auto pen. Presidents going back decades have used the auto pen, and the Justice Department, even under Republican presidents, has said the auto pen is okay. That said, I will say I have strong concerns, not just as a constitutional lawyer, but as an American, about Biden's use of the auto pen in the waning days of his administration. In other words, if this auto pen was being used in a way that President Biden himself just wasn't aware of or didn't authorize, that's a problem. And what we've been hearing about the waning days, the final few months of the Biden administration, somewhat very disturbing things were going on. Maybe things were happening without the president's authorization or knowledge, which to my mind raises far greater constitutional concerns than his use of the auto pen.
Well, we know of at least one pardon that President Trump thinks is valid that came from Biden, and that was for Hunter. He believes that the former president did, in fact, pardon his son, fully intentionally. So at least Hunter's safe, I guess.
Hunter gets
Tom
it.
Dupree, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.